Just to be clear, there were 1,080 Star Destroyers at Exegol. Each one requires a minimum of 29,000 crew to operate. That's 31 million people. Recruited, trained, and stationed in secret, without anyone noticing. Let that number sit for a moment. 31 million. That's roughly the population of Peru, or Malaysia. Imagine hiding Malaysia underground on a dead planet for 30 years. Nobody notices. Nobody asks questions. These 31 million people just exist, somehow fed, somehow trained, somehow loyal to a corpse emperor who fell down a reactor shaft in 4 ABY. Today I'm doing what the sequel trilogy never did. I'm showing my work. Because here's the thing. Star Wars used to care about this stuff. Not in a tedious, footnote-every-detail kind of way, but in the way that good storytelling always cares about its own internal logic. The franchise built its world-building credibility on foundations that made sense within the fiction. And then the sequel trilogy took those foundations, set them on fire, and asked us to applaud the flames. I'm not here to rage about it. Rage is exhausting, and frankly, boring. What I'm here to do is far more damning. I'm going to walk through the math, compare it to what came before, and let the numbers speak for themselves. So let's start with what believable fleet logistics actually look like. The Venator-class Star Destroyer remains the gold standard of believable fleet logistics in Star Wars. Not because the prequel era was perfect, it wasn't, but it tried. It showed its work. It respected the audience enough to explain where things came from, and that made all the difference. The timeline begins in 32 BBY, a full 10 years before the Clone Wars erupted. Jedi Master Sifo-Dyas experienced force visions of a galactic conflict that the Republic wasn't remotely prepared to fight. Acting without authorization from the Jedi Council, which would later cost him dearly, Sifo-Dyas contacted Prime Minister Lama of Kamino and commissioned what would become the Clone Army. He lied, claiming the Galactic Senate had placed the order. The Kaminoans didn't ask too many questions. They were the galaxy's foremost experts in large-scale cloning, and someone was offering them a massive contract. They accepted. 10 years. That's how long the Kaminoans said they needed to grow, train, and prepare the initial deployment of clone troopers. Not 10 days, not 10 months, 10 years of gestation chambers, accelerated aging, combat simulations, and indoctrination protocols. When Obi-Wan Kenobi stumbles onto Kamino in Attack of the Clones and tours the facilities, we see it all. Embryonic growth chambers, adolescent clones in classrooms, adult soldiers running combat drills. The production pipeline is visible, documented, logical within its fiction. The first reinforcement to Geonosis comprised 192,000 clone troopers, transported aboard 12 Acclamator-class assault ships. That's a substantial deployment, but it's also a number that makes sense given what we've seen. A decade of preparation, a dedicated facility, a species whose entire economy revolves around genetic engineering. The Venator-class Star Destroyer itself emerged from this infrastructure. Measuring 1,137 meters in length, designed to serve as both battleship and starfighter carrier, each Venator required a crew complement of 7,400 naval personnel. That's it. 7,400 people to run a ship capable of deploying 420 fighters and going toe-to-toe with separatist dreadnoughts. Add roughly 2,000 embarked clone troopers, and you're looking at under 10,000 personnel per capital ship. And where were these ships built? At Kuat Drive Yards, one of the galaxy's largest shipbuilding operations. A facility whose location was public knowledge, whose supply chains ran through charted hyperspace lanes, whose production capacity drew upon thousands of member worlds in the Republic. The fleet was built in plain sight, crewed by personnel recruited or cloned through documented programs. When characters in the Clone Wars discuss deployments and production timelines, they reference real constraints, resources, schedules, availability. The narrative treats logistics as something that matters. Anyone who spent hours playing Battlefront 2 remembers what this attention to detail produced in the fiction. There's a particular thrill to flying between the Venator's split bridge towers during those space battles, threading your starfighter through that narrow gap while laser fire traces lines across the void. That split bridge design existed for a reason. One tower for ship operations, one for fleet coordination, reflecting the Venator's dual role. Someone thought about why the ship looked the way it did. The design meant something, and behind it all sat a functioning galactic economy. This point deserves emphasis because it becomes critical later. The Republic didn't conjure its military from nothing. The Senate took loans from the intergalactic banking clan to finance the war effort, a plot point that the Clone Wars series explores in detail. Credits flowed through established financial institutions. Shipyards submitted contracts. Raw materials arrived via documented trade routes. The clone army itself represented a 10-year investment paid through channels that, while secretive, operated within recognizable economic frameworks. When the war bills came due, senators argued about taxation and deficit spending. The galaxy's economy strained under military production. These constraints weren't just narrative window dressing. They grounded the entire conflict in a recognizable reality, where resources have limits and logistics matter. The Galactic Empire inherited this infrastructure following Palpatine's declaration of the New Order in 19 BBY, and immediately expanded it through methods that were ruthless but economically coherent. The Empire nationalized major industries. It seized control of the banking clan's assets. It imposed tribute systems on member worlds. It conscripted labor. The entire galactic economy now served the military apparatus, and that apparatus grew accordingly. The Imperial-class Star Destroyer, that iconic wedge shape burned into everyone's memory, measured 1,600 meters in length, bigger than the Venator, required 37,085 officers and enlisted personnel, plus 9,700 stormtroopers, plus pilots and gunners and support staff that brought total shipboard population to nearly 47,000 per vessel. 47,000 people per ship. Enormous numbers. But the Empire possessed the resources to meet them. A galaxy-spanning authoritarian government. Mandatory conscription programs. Naval academies producing officers by the thousands annually. Shipyards operating at maximum capacity across the core and mid-rim. 23 years of totalitarian resource allocation, backed by an economy that, however oppressively managed, actually existed. The Imperial fleet's growth was achievable. Morally repugnant, yes, but logistically plausible. Which brings us to the First Order. And this is where the world-building rot that culminates in the Final Order first becomes visible. The problems don't start at Exegol. They start the moment we're asked to believe that Imperial remnants hiding in uncharted space could build anything more threatening than a pirate fleet. After the Empire's defeat at Endor in 4 ABY, and the Galactic Concordance that ended the war in 5 ABY, Imperial remnants fled into the unknown regions. Over the next 30 years, these survivors supposedly constructed not just a replacement fleet, an improved one. They built Resurgent-class Star Destroyers, measuring 2,915 meters in length, nearly double the size of an Imperial class. And they built Starkiller Base. Let's talk about Starkiller Base for a moment, because if you think the Final Order's logistics are broken, the First Order's flagship project sets the template. Starkiller Base was carved into the planet Ilum, a world sacred to the Jedi Order for thousands of years, the primary source of kyber crystals used in lightsaber construction. The First Order hollowed out significant portions of this planet, installed a superweapon capable of destroying entire star systems from across the galaxy, and created a facility that dwarfed both Death Stars combined. The original Death Star measured 160 kilometers in diameter. Starkiller Base converted an entire planetary body into a weapon platform. The logistics required for this project beggar belief. Mining operations to hollow out planetary sections. Manufacturing facilities to construct the thermal oscillator and containment systems. Crew quarters for the tens of thousands of personnel required to operate the base. Defensive installations, hangar bays, power systems capable of draining a star. The construction timeline remains unspecified in canon, but even assuming the First Order began work immediately after fleeing into the unknown regions, They had 30 years to complete a project that would have challenged the fully operational Galactic Empire. And they did this while simultaneously building a fleet of Resurgent-class Star Destroyers, while establishing the military academies needed to train crews, while developing new TIE fighter variants and ground assault vehicles, while constructing the Supremacy. The Supremacy, Snoke's flagship. The mega-class Star Dreadnought that served as the First Order's mobile capital during The Last Jedi. This single vessel measured approximately 60 kilometers in wingspan. 60 kilometers. For context, that's roughly the distance from downtown Manhattan to the end of Long Island. The ship was so large it functioned as a mobile shipyard, reportedly capable of constructing additional Star Destroyers within its own hull. Crew complement estimates for a vessel this size, based on scaling from smaller Star Destroyer classes, would run into the hundreds of thousands at minimum. Some calculations suggest over 2 million personnel to fully staff a ship of this magnitude. Where did these people come from? The Imperial remnants fleeing into the unknown regions consisted of a fraction of the former Empire's military. Ships that survived Endor. Ships that survived Jakku. Ships that survived the mopping up operations that followed. What they didn't possess: major shipyards, established supply chains, recruitment infrastructure, a tax base. The unknown regions, by definition, contained few charted worlds, even fewer with industrial capacity to support capital ship construction. The First Order had no economy, not in any meaningful sense. They controlled no major population centers. They collected no taxes. They operated no banking systems. They couldn't finance military production through loans because no financial institution operated in uncharted space. They couldn't conscript labor from subject populations because they ruled no subjects until The Force Awakens begins. Everything they built, every Star Destroyer, every TIE fighter, every bolt in Starkiller Base's superstructure, came from resources they either brought with them from the Empire's collapse or extracted from unknown regions' worlds through processes the narrative never bothers to explain. Canon sources offer vague references to secret benefactors among First Order sympathizers in the New Republic and hidden shipyards in unexplored space. These aren't explanations, they're shrugs. They're the storytelling equivalent of a student writing, "The dog ate my homework," on a physics exam. The logistics required for the First Order's known achievements, not counting anything that comes later, are so laughable that examining them produces embarrassment rather than insight. Think about what building the Supremacy alone would require. 60 kilometers of hull plating, reactor cores capable of powering a mobile city, weapons systems, sensor arrays, life support for a crew that could populate a small country. The Empire, with full galactic resources, never built anything approaching this scale. The First Order, with scraps and refugees, supposedly exceeded Imperial ambitions within 3 decades while hiding from the New Republic's notice. The First Order's resources problem is so severe that careful examination reveals it shouldn't exist as a functioning military organization, let alone one capable of threatening a galactic government. But wait, it gets worse. The Final Order makes the First Order's implausibility look like rigorous logistics planning. Emperor Palpatine, who died when Vader threw him down a reactor shaft, apparently transferred his consciousness into a cloned body on Exegol. Over 30 years, from 4 ABY through 35 ABY, Palpatine and his Sith Eternal cult built 1,080 Zeiston-class Star Destroyers in underground shipyards carved from the planet's bedrock. 1,080 ships, each one 2,406 meters long, each one equipped with an axial superlaser capable of destroying planets. The combined firepower of this fleet made both Death Stars look like proof-of-concept prototypes. Why build one vulnerable battle station when you can distribute planet-killing capability across 1,000 mobile platforms? Remember how the First Order had no economy? The Sith Eternal had even less. At least the First Order could theoretically raid unknown region settlements or receive covert support from sympathizers in known space. The Sith Eternal operated exclusively on Exegol, a world so hidden that reaching it required navigating through a region of space called the Red Honeycomb Zone, a barrier of cosmic anomalies that destroyed ships without proper guidance. No supply convoys, no trade routes, no external contact of any kind. Everything the Sith Eternal built came from Exegol itself, or resources stockpiled before the operation began. The production challenges alone obliterate credulity. Building a single Star Destroyer requires specialized shipyard facilities, enormous quantities of refined metals, sophisticated manufacturing equipment, thousands of skilled workers operating for months or years. The Empire, controlling galactic resources and operating shipyards across thousands of worlds, produced Star Destroyers at a rate of a few dozen per year across all its combined shipyards. The Sith Eternal, operating on one hidden world with no external supply chain and no legitimate resource access, supposedly exceeded this production rate while maintaining complete secrecy for 3 decades. They built more capital ships than the Empire deployed at its height, using only what they could produce internally or smuggle through unknown regions routes. On a planet perpetually shrouded in electrical storms, with no agricultural capacity, no sunlight, no external support, and somehow nobody noticed. But the shipbuilding challenge isn't even the main problem. The personnel requirement is where the math becomes truly damning. The 31 million crew members necessary to operate the Zeistan fleet didn't emerge from cloning facilities like the Republic's army. No Kaminoan equivalent production capacity existed on Exegol. Canon sources suggest the Sith Eternal relied on a breeding program, generations of children raised in underground complexes, indoctrinated from birth into absolute Sith loyalty. Okay, let's examine that explanation. Where did the initial population come from? How did a breeding program produce 31 million people in 30 years? Natural human reproduction, even with medical intervention, can't achieve those numbers from any plausible starting population. A woman can bear, maybe 10 to 15 children in a lifetime under extreme circumstances? Even assuming accelerated maturation, which the canon doesn't support for non-clones, you'd need an initial population of millions just to approach the final numbers through breeding alone. What did these millions eat? Exegol's surface is barren. Perpetual lightning storms. No sunlight. Conventional agriculture is impossible. Feeding 31 million people requires industrial-scale hydroponic facilities and protein synthesis operations rivaling the shipyard complexes themselves. The food production logistics alone should have required half the planet's resources. How are they trained? Operating a Star Destroyer isn't like flipping burgers. You need navigation officers who understand hyperspace calculations, engineering technicians who can maintain reactor systems, weapons specialists, communications officers, damage control teams, medical staff, hundreds of specializations. The Imperial Navy ran academies across hundreds of worlds, multi-year programs combining classroom instruction with practical shipboard experience. The Sith Eternal had none of this infrastructure. Their personnel trained entirely on Exegol, in simulations, on mock-ups, never experiencing actual space operations until the fleet launched for its first and only mission. 31 million people achieved combat-ready proficiency this way. Sure, the comparison across Star Destroyer classes makes the escalating absurdity impossible to ignore. The Venator-class, 1,137 meters, 7,400 crew, built by a galactic government with documented shipyards, a functioning economy, loans from the banking clan, and a clone army to fill personnel needs. The Imperial class, 1,600 meters, 46,000 personnel, including troops, built by a totalitarian state with conscription powers, nationalized industry, and galaxy-spanning resources. The Resurgent class, 2,915 meters, built by Imperial remnants with undefined, secret resources that the narrative declines to examine. The Zeistan class, 2,406 meters, 29,585 crew, built by a cult on a dead planet with no external support, no economy, no population base, and no credible explanation for anything the operation required. Each generation of Star Destroyer grows larger. The political entities constructing them grow smaller and less capable. The world building explaining their production grows lazier until it vanishes entirely into silence and hand-waving. This progression isn't epic storytelling. It's escalation without foundation, spectacle without substance. Every new trilogy tried to one-up what came before, bigger ships, bigger weapons, bigger stakes, without any corresponding investment in explaining how these escalations became possible. The defense sometimes offered for this approach, that Star Wars has never been hard science fiction, that audiences don't watch for realistic logistics, fails to account for the franchise's own established standards. George Lucas understood that believable world building requires showing your work. The prequel trilogy, whatever its other flaws, took the clone army seriously enough to explain where it came from, how long it took, why the Republic accepted it. The original trilogy presented the Empire as a galactic government capable of constructing massive installations because it controlled galactic resources. The sequel trilogy abandoned this approach entirely. Starkiller Base appears without explanation. The Supremacy appears without explanation. The Final Order fleet appears without explanation. The filmmakers trusted that audiences would be too dazzled by spectacle to perform basic arithmetic. And you know what's frustrating? The problems could have been avoided so easily. If the Final Order fleet numbered 100 ships instead of 1,000, the crew requirement drops to 3 million. Still enormous for a secret cult, but approaching plausibility for a multi-generational operation with aggressive recruitment in unknown regions' settlements. If the Zeiston class relied heavily on automation to reduce crew requirements below 10,000, the math becomes survivable. The dossier notes that automation systems already reduce the Zeiston crew complement compared to earlier classes, so the technology existed within the fiction. Push that concept further. 5,000 crew per ship, even 2,000. Suddenly you need 5 million people instead of 31 million. If the narrative included even one scene showing Sith Eternal operatives recruiting in Outer Rim settlements, smuggling families to Exegol, building their population through something other than pure underground breeding, the 31 million figure gains at least a thin justification. Instead, the filmmakers chose the largest possible number for maximum visual impact. They wanted 1,080 ships because 1,000 of anything sounds impressive. They wanted planet-killing weapons on every ship because that raises the stakes beyond the Death Stars. They wanted an armada that would dwarf anything seen before because escalation was easier than imagination. They wagered that spectacle would overwhelm scrutiny. And honestly, for a lot of audiences, in the moment, in the theater, with John Williams swelling in the background and starfighters weaving through laser fire, it probably worked. The problems only become apparent later, when you're lying in bed at 2 a.m. thinking, wait, where did Palpatine get 31 million people? But the wager has a cost. Every time someone revisits The Rise of Skywalker, the seams show more clearly. Every time someone compares it to what came before, to Kamino's rain-swept platforms and Obi-Wan's tour of the growth chambers, the contrast becomes more damning. The prequels, for all their dialogue issues and pacing problems, built a world that held together. The sequels built a spectacle that collapses under its own weight. The Venator-class Star Destroyer earned its place in Star Wars iconography, not through sheer size or firepower, but through context. It existed within a coherent military and industrial framework. Its split bridge design meant something. Its fighter complement served a tactical purpose. Its production at Kuat drive yards connected to a larger galactic economy. When you see a Venator in the Clone Wars, you understand where it came from. You can trace the causation. When you see a Zeiston-class Star Destroyer rising from Exegol's underground shipyards, you understand nothing. You cannot trace the causation because there is no causation to trace. The ships exist because the scene required them. The crew exists because ships need crew. The production capacity exists because otherwise the ships couldn't exist. It's circular logic masquerading as world building. And look, I get that Star Wars is fantasy. I get that we're talking about space wizards and laser swords and faster-than-light travel. I'm not asking for engineering blueprints and economic modeling. I'm asking for the franchise to meet its own established standards, to show its work the way it used to earn its spectacles, rather than simply demanding we accept them. 31 million people. That number sits at the center of everything wrong with the sequel trilogy's approach to world building. It's not just implausible, it's contemptuous. It assumes the audience won't notice, won't care, won't do the basic multiplication that reveals the absurdity. It treats Star Wars fans like consumers of visual noise rather than participants in a story that spans decades and deserves internal consistency. So next time someone tells you the sequel trilogy makes sense, next time someone argues that Star Wars has always been fantasy, that logistics don't matter, that audiences should simply accept spectacle without question, ask them where Palpatine found 31 million people willing to crew ships on a dead planet. And then ask them to show their work. Subscribe for more stories like this.